Night had settled over the battered edge of the Allied line, but the forest was alive with a steady pulse of sound, men breathing heavily under the weight of equipment, branches snapping under thousands of boots, and the unrelenting crackle of shouted orders. It had been 24 hours since the Germans launched their massive counter-offensive, and along the Colmar pocket, the situation for the Americans had turned grim. Units were scattered, communications were breaking down, and the Germans were pushing with a ferocity the green American troops had never experienced. Yet somewhere in that shrouded darkness a silent force was watching over them, a force that no enemy patrol could see, hear, or target. An innovation, never written into the manuals, but built into the guns that had come with them across the Atlantic. That invisible safeguard was bringing order to chaos, even as confusion reigned through the trees. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The men of the 10th Mountain Division had arrived under the impression that they were trained for climbing and skying, not for holding a collapsing line against a determined German army. Their commanders had drilled them in mobility, teaching them to move across broken terrain with speed and finesse, but no one had truly prepared them for what it felt like to stare down a force that seemed willing to burn itself out just to break their position. And as darkness swallowed the sky, every man on the American side felt something closing, in a sense that the Germans were ready to overrun them, to sweep through their defenses and carve out a new foothold that would alter the course of the final months of the war. And then the miracle came first in the shape of a single sergeant, soaked and exhausted, stumbling into a command post to deliver a report. What had seemed like a full-scale German attack, he said, was not what it appeared. His platoon had been pinned down, the enemy seemingly everywhere, pushing them backward. But when the smoke cleared and he walked the field, he discovered something startling. The German attack had not been a decisive, coordinated assault. It had been only 25 men, 25, who had somehow convinced an entire American unit that they were facing a regiment. Panic had filled the gaps left by confusion, and confusion had done more damage than bullets. It was the kind of psychological blow that could topple an army if not controlled. Yet that night, the Americans did not crumble. Something held the line firm, something far beyond the shouted commands of officers or the courage of weary soldiers. What held the line was geometry grids and squares, and silent maps stacked inside the heads of the men who had trained on a particular method of artillery, fire that the Germans had never understood. It was a technique invisible to the eye, inaudible to the mind, yet devastating in its consequences. Even in the confusion of the forest, the American artillery crews could hit any point on the battlefield without seeing it, without adjusting for it, without waiting for spotters or calculations. The enemy had no idea how exposed they were. No clue that every movement they made could be plotted, predicted, and punished by a system that seemed almost supernatural in its speed. While the infantry reeled from the shock of the German push, the artillery crews worked like machines, laying out firing data with the confidence of men who understood the battlefield more intimately than anyone else. They knew that every patch of land around them existed inside a grid system, so precise that hitting it required only a pair of simple numbers and a few practiced motions. The Germans believed that American accuracy had to depend on spotters or elaborate preparations, but this night, and many others, proved how wrong they were. In the darkness, American guns barked with unwavering calm, their shells soaring through the canopy and slamming into German positions before those positions even realized they had been discovered. Behind each gun stood a team of young men, some barely older than 18, yet they worked with the synchronized grace of seasoned craftsmen. To them, the battlefield was not chaos, it was a diagram. To the Germans, the forest was a shield. To the Americans firing the rounds, it was nothing more than numbered squares arranged across a landscape they did not need to see in order to dominate. Every gun crew relied on a single central reference point, a concept the transcript called registration. With registration complete, a crew could unleash devastating fire anywhere in the mapped terrain with terrifying speed. The Germans could not comprehend how the Americans always seemed ready, always able to fire accurately, even when surprised. and that ignorance cost them dearly. This system, this invisible edge, depended entirely on the understanding that artillery could be pre-plotted. The guns did not need to spend time adjusting for new angles or distances. They had already done the work. Each square of ground had been measured. Each potential enemy position had been unlocked like a pre-written code. When the Germans attacked, thinking they could overwhelm the Americans before the artillery could respond, they found themselves swallowed in a hailstorm of shells almost instantly. That night near the Colmar pocket was only one example among thousands, but it was a moment where the system proved its worth in a way that saved lives. The forest amplified every explosion, turning each impact into a rolling thunder that washed over the battlefield. German voices shouted in panic, their formations twisting apart in the darkness. The Americans, though shaken, could hear the distant roar of their supporting fire, and many of them realized for the first time that they were not fighting alone. Even when cut off from sight, from radios, from clarity, the artillery knew exactly where they were and exactly where the enemy had to be. It did not matter that the infantry could not give perfect coordinates. The grid system filled in the gaps. The invisible innovation covered the map like a protective dome. As the Germans advanced, thinking they had caught the Americans unprepared, the artillery responded with perfect mathematical vengeance. The shells crashed down on crossroads, ravines, tree lines, and suspected assembly points, each chosen not through guesswork, but through a system that had been trained into every American artillery unit. The men who designed it had understood something simple. War moved too fast for lengthy calculations. A crew needed to fire now, not in 5 minutes. And because of that, the Americans developed a method that seemed like magic to their enemies. In the transcript, the narrator emphasized how the Germans never figured it out. Despite fighting the Americans for years, despite facing their artillery on countless fronts, the Germans remained baffled. They believed the Americans must have had superior spotters or better technology, and a system so quietly effective that it left almost no trace of its brilliance. And so German units throughout the war found themselves subjected to the same shock, believing they had the advantage, only to be shattered by artillery that reacted faster than any trained eye could. The night wore on, and as the Americans regained their footing, the psychological weight shifted. The Germans had expected to break them, but instead found themselves bleeding strength against an unseen force. Shells thumped across the forest with relentless rhythm, turning the ground into fire-lit bursts of dirt and metal. The young infantrymen, who had earlier believed they were being overrun, now sensed the tide turning. It was the same pattern as before: panic, confusion, then clarity brought by artillery. The sergeant who had walked the battlefield earlier understood better than most how important the artillery had been. If the grid system had not been in place, the Germans might have broken through before the Americans even identified the threat. Instead, the artillery had responded instantly, and that response rippled through the line like a stabilizing hand. The sergeant's report of 25 Germans nearly causing a collapse was a reminder of how fragile morale could be. But the invisible innovation had ensured the collapse never came. Across the forest, the guns continued their work. Each firing team was soaked with sweat, their muscles aching from loading shells again and again, but they did not slow. They knew the stakes. The enemy was counting on speed, on terror, on the darkness to shield their movements. The gunners countered with precision, repetition, and the invisible map etched into their minds. Some of the guns had been calibrated earlier that day, others weeks before, but it did not matter. The system held. The registration held. The grid did not change, and because of that, every German who moved through that forest risked walking directly into a storm they could not see coming. Dawn approached slowly, a grey smear stretching across the sky, revealing the battlefield in scattered fragments. Smoke drifted lazily between the trees. The remnants of the German attack lay strewn across the snow and mud, evidence of how quickly a determined assault could crumble under the weight of disciplined artillery fire. The American infantry, exhausted but standing, understood now how close they had come to disaster and how the invisible innovation had saved them. But for the artillery crews, There was no moment of revelation. They had expected this outcome. To them, the grid system was not magic. It was muscle memory. Their hands had moved automatically, dialing in the familiar numbers, pulling the lanyards, preparing the next round. They had grown up listening to instructors repeat the same mantra. Registration gives you control. Control of the battlefield. Control of the timing. Control of the outcome. That night, control had made all the difference. And so, as the sun broke through the trees, casting light across the battered clearing, the American line still stood. The Germans had failed not because they lacked bravery, or firepower, or resolve. They had failed because they stepped into a battlefield already mapped, measured, and mastered by an invisible hand. That hand belonged to the unseen innovation woven into every American artillery piece, an innovation their enemies could not comprehend. And as long as it remained invisible, it remained unstoppable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The morning light did little to lift the fatigue from the faces of the American soldiers who had held the line through the night. Their uniforms were stiff with frozen mud, their rifles slung low at their sides, their breaths hanging thick in the cold air. But as they scanned the landscape, taking in the shell-pocked earth and the shattered remnants of the German assault, a quiet realization settled over them. Nor because the enemy lacked the will to fight, but because something far beyond their sight had guided every moment of the battle. The artillery positions sat farther to the rear, hidden behind folds of earth and tree lines. Even from a distance, the men on the line could hear the occasional shout of a crew chief, the metallic clatter of empty shell casings swept aside, and the groan of heavy equipment being readied again. The gunners were already preparing for the next shift, their bodies moving slowly but with practiced efficiency. They had worked through the night without rest, but there was no question of slowing down now. The battlefield waited for no one. Farther back, the officers reviewed the night's events, piecing together how a unit nearly pushed to the brink had steadied itself in time to hold the German advance. Their maps were littered with pencil marks, grid numbers, and hastily scrawled notations. Yet one detail stood out above all others. Every time the infantry requested fire, or even when they couldn't, the artillery had responded instantly and accurately. That speed had not only broken the German push, but had prevented panic from spreading through the American units. The invisible system had turned the tide long before dawn arrived. Near the artillery batteries, the men moved with a rhythm that betrayed an intimate understanding of the work. Guns were swabbed, mechanisms checked, elevation wheels spun to test their smoothness. The crews talked in low voices as they prepared fresh crates of shells, their conversations revealing not just fatigue but pride. They all knew what they had accomplished. They had watched the sky flash with every shell fired, had felt the earth tremble under each recoil, had worked through the deafening roar that echoed through the valley. And through it all, the grid system held steady, guiding every round toward its target with the certainty of a practiced hand. One of the crewmen, his face streaked with soot and sweat, leaned heavily against the trail of his gun, sipping from a canteen. The night's firing had pushed them hard, but his eyes held a steady, unshakable calm. He had watched new recruits join his team earlier in the war, seen how shocked they were when they first learned that the artillery did not need spotters to fire effectively. Most of them had been accustomed to the idea that accuracy required eyes on the target. But here, in the American system, the eyes were replaced by numbers, precise, reliable, repeatable numbers. And once the recruits understood that, everything about the battlefield changed for them. The German prisoners captured that morning looked around in disbelief as they were marched past the artillery positions. Many had assumed the Americans must have used massive observation posts or aerial units to guide their fire, seeing the guns up close being tended by young men who looked barely old enough to shave only deepened their confusion. They had fought armies across Europe and believed they understood how artillery functioned, but nothing they had faced had ever reacted with such speed or consistency. It felt almost unnatural, as though the Americans had predicted their movements before they made them. As the morning stretched onward, Officers gathered their soldiers to relay what intelligence had revealed. The revelation stirred mixed emotions among the men. Some felt embarrassment at how quickly fear had spread in the night. Others felt relief that the enemy's strength had been far less than expected. But nearly all of them felt an increased respect for the artillery, realizing now how close they had come to disaster and how decisively the invisible innovation had protected them. The sergeant who had discovered the truth of the German numbers moved quietly among the men, offering reassurance where he could. His own realization had shaken him at first. To think that a mere 25 Germans had nearly torn a hole in their line was humbling, yet it underscored how essential coordination was. How vital it was for every soldier, infantry and artillery alike to trust in the system that guided them. Behind the lines, the gun crews continued their maintenance, speaking with the low, confident tone of men who understood the pivotal role they played. Every part of their equipment mattered, every scale, every dial, every mark along the elevation wheel. They checked and rechecked each mechanism, not because someone ordered it, but because they knew the system worked only if they made it work. Accuracy was not magic. It was the product of discipline and repetition. The Germans had always believed the Americans relied heavily on technology, that their advantage came from equipment rather than training. But the grid system defied that assumption. It was not mechanical superiority, it was methodological superiority. The system required only maps, pencils, and an unwavering commitment to precision. No matter how chaotic the battlefield became, the grid remained the same. As the artillerymen wiped down their guns and loaded fresh rounds into ready bins, a new sense of purpose settled over them. They had proven the worth of their training, and they knew there would be more battles ahead. The war was nearing its end, but the Germans were far from finished. The unpredictable fury of their opposition demanded constant vigilance. Back at the command post, officers reviewed anticipated German movements. In previous operations, they had learned that the enemy often attempted counterattacks at dawn or dusk, exploiting moments when visibility was poor. But here, the Americans had an answer no matter the time of day. If the Germans moved in darkness, the grid system neutralized their advantage. If they waited until first light, the artillery would still be ready. As noon approached, a light snow began to fall over the battlefield. It drifted softly across shell craters and frozen earth, covering the scars of the previous night. For the men on the line, the snowfall was a welcome calm. The forest seemed quieter, the air less tense. But beneath the surface of that calm was a shared recognition of what had transpired. The Germans had tried to break them, had nearly succeeded, but they had underestimated the Americans' ability to strike back instantly. The gunners gathered for a short rest, sitting on ammunition crates or leaning against the wheels of their guns. Their chatter was subdued but steady. Some joked lightly about the night's chaos. Others discussed how close the German advance had come. A few simply stared into the distance, lost in their thoughts. But there was a unity among them, a sense that they had all stood together in a moment of extreme pressure and emerged stronger for it. The grid system itself was never the hero in the stories the infantry told. It had no face, no voice. It did not climb into foxholes or charge through the trees. But its influence was everywhere. It had allowed the artillery to respond instantly, without hesitation. It had allowed the infantry to regain their footing even when the situation seemed hopeless. It had turned scattered battlefield information into decisive action. By afternoon, the officers had begun preparing new firing solutions, mapping out potential German routes of retreat or regrouping. They studied the terrain, matching landmarks to grid numbers, ready to strike wherever necessary. The Americans had no intention of letting them. The infantry watched with renewed confidence as the artillery prepared. They knew that when the next attack came, whether hours or days from now, the grid system would be ready. The invisible innovation that had saved them once would save them again. It was their silent guardian, always watching, always prepared. As the day faded into evening, a cold wind swept over the battlefield. The trees creaked softly, and the sky darkened once again. Lamps flickered to life in the command posts, casting long shadows across maps and equipment. The men braced themselves for another night, but this time, fear did not dominate their thoughts. They had seen what the artillery could do. They had felt its protection in their darkest hour, and they knew that as long as the grid remained, the enemy would never truly catch them unaware. Night returned to the forest with the same heavy stillness that had blanketed it the evening before. But the mood among the American forces was markedly different. The fear and uncertainty that had seeped into every corner of the line were gone, replaced by a firm, disciplined calm. The men stood at their posts not because they were unafraid, but because they now understood the terrain in a way the enemy never would. It hid the American infantry just as well as it hid the Germans, but more importantly, it concealed the guns that had proven their dominance time and time again. Far behind the line, the artillery crews prepared for another long night, working with the same measured precision that had guided them through countless engagements. Their guns stood like shadowed sentinels, covered in frost that glimmered faintly in the moonlight. The crews moved quietly, checking fuses, aligning trails, and reviewing the grids once more as if performing a ritual. They never spoke of superstition, yet every man knew that their careful habits were part of what kept them alive. Each gun captain ran his hand along the breech, feeling for any roughness, any imperfection that might hinder the perfect execution of a fire mission. These weapons were more than tools. They were extensions of the men themselves, instruments of mathematical certainty and destructive power. They had been dragged across continents, through storms, over mountains, and into forests like this one. Now they waited in silence, poised to unleash the same precise fury that had shattered the German assault the night before. In the command posts, officers once again traced the familiar network of grids across their maps, marking possible routes the enemy might attempt to exploit. Every ridge and ravine had been studied until its shape was etched into memory. Most of the officers had not slept more than a handful of hours in the past 2 days, but fatigue was overshadowed by vigilance. The Germans had shown their willingness to strike in the dark. The Americans would not allow themselves to be caught off guard. The infantry sheltered behind trees, foxholes, and hastily constructed defensive works. Their rifles rested across their knees, bayonets fixed, ammunition checked and rechecked. The men were quiet, listening for the telltale signs of movement in the forest. A snapped branch, a distant shout, the grinding of equipment. They had learned a hard truth the night before. Small groups of Germans could create an illusion of overwhelming force in the right conditions. Now every sound carried weight. Yet behind this tension was a steady reassurance. The artillery was ready. A cold mist drifted through the trees as the hours passed. It clung to uniforms and equipment, dimming lanterns and swallowing light, and still the men waited. Some whispered about the 25 Germans who had nearly caused a collapse. Others spoke quietly of how the guns had stopped them, how the forest had lit up with fire just when hope seemed to fade. These whispered conversations spread not as fear, but as understanding. The line had held because something unseen had been watching over them. Toward midnight, distant German activity stirred. The sound was faint at first, a murmur carried on the wind, the scuff of boots over frozen earth, the rustle of undergrowth disturbed by careful hands. The Americans listened with growing attention. They did not move, did not call out, did not reveal their positions. They simply waited, letting the tension build like the drawing of a bowstring. In the rear, the artillery fire direction centers received their first indications. Reports arrived in fragments, suspected movement along a particular coordinate, shadows spotted shifting near a tree line, faint silhouettes crossing open ground. No clear targets, yet just possibilities. But possibilities were enough. The grid system thrived on possibilities. The officers read the reports, cross-referenced the coordinates, and began preparing firing solutions. They did not wait for confirmation from spotters. The system did not require it. They knew the landscape, knew the ranges, and knew how the Germans tended to maneuver when probing a line. The mathematics of war were already unfolding in their minds. When the first fire mission came down the line, The crews reacted instantly. Commands were shouted in practiced cadence. Breech blocks slammed shut. Guns were aligned, elevations set, fuses adjusted. The ground shuddered under the recoil of each gun. Batteries fired in overlapping rhythm, their shells carving fiery arcs across the sky. The distant forest lit up as explosions rippled through the German approach routes. The infantry watched with grim satisfaction as the artillery answered the threat before the Germans could close the distance. They heard the distant cries of their enemies, the frantic scrambling of units suddenly caught in a storm they had not expected. Once again, the unseen hand had intervened. Within minutes, the attack faltered. German movement became scattered, their formations collapsing as they tried to escape the hell descending upon them. The Americans advanced cautiously, using the artillery's barrage as cover, confirming that the attack had been neutralized before it could truly begin. By the time the guns fell silent, the enemy had retreated into the woods, their attempt thwarted before it ever reached its full strength. The Americans stood ready, but no further assault came. The forest settled into uneasy quiet once more. Later, as the units regrouped and assessed the situation, the truth became apparent. The Germans had again committed only a small force, relying on surprise and psychological impact. But the element of surprise had died the moment the first grid numbers were relayed to the rear. The grid system, once more, had proven decisive. The officers reviewed the night's events, marking German attempts and American responses. They noted with quiet satisfaction how quickly the artillery had mobilized, how flawlessly the crews had executed their missions. The system's elegance lay in its simplicity. With registration complete, they could strike anywhere with minimal calculations. Around the gun pits, the crews celebrated not with cheers or boasts, but with the quiet pride of craftsmen whose work had again demonstrated its worth. Some leaned against their guns, panting from the exertion. Others busied themselves preparing for the next mission, refusing to let complacency seep in. They knew the Germans might try again before dawn. The infantry felt the difference too. The anxiety that had once simmered inside them was now tempered by trust. Reach, seen how swiftly it could break an attack. They felt connected to the invisible system, protected by it, and they held the line with renewed confidence. As the first hints of morning crept over the horizon, painting the sky in cold shades of blue and grey, the Americans surveyed the field. The fog lifted slowly, revealing the aftermath of the night's clash. This time the casualties were fewer. The Germans had been stopped earlier, pushed back before they could gain momentum, and as the light grew, so did the understanding among the Americans. The invisible innovation was not just a tactical advantage. It was the backbone of their survival. It was the method that allowed young soldiers, many fighting their first battles, to stand firm against experienced German troops. It was the system that transformed confusion into control, panic into precision. The Germans, for all their skill and determination, never understood the secret. They fought armies across Europe, but never uncovered the method that made American artillery so devastating. They could not comprehend how the Americans always seemed ready, always able to respond faster than expected. To the Germans, the system remained a mystery. To the Americans, it remained their lifeline. And as long as the grid was in place, mapped out in the minds of the artillerymen, and etched across the landscape of every battlefield, the unseen force would continue to shield them, night after night, until the war at last reached its end. The trees stood pale and skeletal in the early light, their branches coated in frost that glittered like shattered glass. Smoke drifted lazily above the forest floor, curling around broken branches and half-buried shell impacts. Every crater, every torn patch of earth bore silent witness to the night's exchange of fire. The American infantry moved cautiously through the thinning fog, checking positions, counting heads, making sure the line held as firmly as they thought it had. The adrenaline had faded, leaving exhaustion in its place, but there was pride too quiet, sober pride. They knew they had faced something dangerous in the darkness, something that could have swept through them if not for the steady hand of the artillery behind them. They found no massed bodies, no wrecked vehicles, no elaborate staging points, just dispersed markings, discarded equipment, and the uneasy realization that once again the Germans had tried to slip through in small numbers, hoping confusion would do the work that force could not. It had almost succeeded the first night. The second night, it hadn't even come close. And somewhere in the forest beyond, there were German soldiers who now knew, with painful clarity, that the Americans could bring thunder down on any patch of earth they chose. By mid-morning, the command posts were reassembling their picture of the battle. Officers huddled over their maps inside dimly lit dugouts, tracing out the previous night's movements with the same attention to detail as a cartographer sketching coastlines. They marked enemy routes, impact zones, and fallback paths. They studied the enemy's pattern. Quick, silent infiltrations, using terrain to mask movement. Attempts to find seams in the line. But seams meant nothing when a single grid coordinate could summon an iron storm in seconds. They replaced fuses, scrubbed breach faces, and checked recoil mechanisms. Some men sat on ammunition crates, staring at their hands as though noticing the grime and trembling for the first time. Others joked quietly, the kind of humor that comes not from light hearts but from deep fatigue. Their officers moved among them, offering nods, brief words of approval. They knew the psychological effect of efficient fire support not just on the enemy, but on their own men. Every infantryman who felt the earth tremble behind him knew he wasn't alone in the fight. Every artilleryman who heard reports of what their fire had prevented understood the weight of their precision. The day remained tense but uneventful. Scouts reported only minimal German probing, nothing like the night before. There was movement deeper in the forest shadows, flitting between trees, the occasional echo of distant boots, but never anything bold. The Germans were cautious now, as if testing the air, uncertain of whether the Americans were as alert during the day as they were in the night. By late afternoon, the sky dimmed beneath thick cloud cover. Snow threatened, drifting down in small, hesitant flakes. The men tightened their coats, rubbed their hands together, and prepared for another long stretch in the cold. A few dared to hope that the night might pass quietly. But hope rarely survived contact with nightfall. As darkness settled over the forest, the wind picked up, carrying a low moan through the trees like a whispered warning. The Americans reinforced their positions, checking ammunition, adjusting their fields of fire, signaling quietly along the line. Lanterns were doused. Cigarettes were cupped in hands. Every sound was measured. Deep in the woods, the Germans gathered again, not in larger numbers but with more caution. They moved like shadows, blending into the dark, studying the terrain that had betrayed them twice already. At first, the Americans heard nothing. The forest was too still, the wind too steady. But then a faint crack echoed from somewhere ahead, a branch under a careless boot. A tiny mistake. It was enough. Within minutes, word passed down the infantry line. Spotters strained their eyes through the dark, searching for silhouettes. Forming the first fragments of a possible fire mission, the Germans crept closer. This time, though, the Americans didn't wait for the enemy to gather strength. The moment the first cluster of movement was confirmed, the faint outline of helmets shifting behind a thicket, a decision rippled through the command posts: strike early. The order went out. In the rear, the artillery sprang to life with a speed that bordered on instinct. Maps were already laid out, firing solutions already half-calculated, trails aligned, elevations set. Fuses cracked open and adjusted with practiced precision. Then the barrage erupted. The ground shook with each report, a near-constant rolling thunder that seemed to rise and fall like the heartbeat of some massive creature. Shells soared overhead, leaving glowing arcs before slamming into the forest ahead. Trees shattered, earth buckled, snow and mud fountained into the air. The night lit up in strobes of orange and white. German units scattered immediately, diving for any cover they could find. But the barrage moved with them, walking across the forest floor in carefully controlled increments, guided not by guesswork but by mathematics. They swept the ground methodically, denying every route, collapsing every attempt at formation. The infantry watched from their positions, their faces illuminated by distant flashes. They didn't cheer. They simply stared, understanding more deeply than ever the power behind them. They watched until the sounds of German retreat grew faint again, swallowed by the forest. When the guns finally fell silent, the night seemed impossibly still, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. No further attack came. Hours passed with uneasy quiet. The Americans remained alert, rifles ready, watching the tree line. But there was nothing, no footsteps, no low German voices, no shifting shadows. Just snow falling lightly onto the churned earth, settling onto branches and cooling the remnants of the earlier bombardment. Sometime near dawn, scouts confirmed what the silence had suggested. The Germans had pulled back farther than before. Not a rout, not a collapse, but a retreat born of caution. The kind of retreat made by men who had learned, through bitter experience, that certain battles were unwinnable. The Americans allowed themselves small exhales of relief. Not celebration, the war was far from over. But they felt the pressure ease, the immediate threat dimming like a distant echo. Back at the artillery positions, the crews finally rested. Some collapsed onto blankets, others leaned back against ammunition stacks and closed their eyes. The officers walked the lines, inspecting equipment, planning the next steps. They all knew the pattern. Where the enemy hesitated, opportunity sometimes followed. But for now, the forest was quiet. For now, the grid system had again proven its worth. And now, the Americans stood unbroken, held together by discipline, by grit, and by the steady, thunderous precision of the guns behind them. Morning broke with a thin veil of fog drifting low over the ground, softening the jagged silhouettes of blasted trees and cratered earth. The forest lay hushed, as if absorbing the echoes of the night's violence, letting them settle into its roots. Where artillery shells had torn apart the soil only hours earlier, wisps of steam still rose faintly in the cold dawn. The men of the American line stood quietly among this aftermath, their breath visible in pale clouds, their eyes scanning the woods with practiced vigilance. Though the Germans had withdrawn deeper into the forest, no one believed the danger had passed. Retreat did not mean surrender. It meant recalculation, repositioning. The kind of silence that followed a failed assault could be more unnerving than the assault itself. The officers convened in a small clearing, sheltered by overlapping branches. They unrolled their maps and began marking the night's fire patterns, noting where the Germans had advanced, where they had broken off, and where the forest still seemed disturbed. The ground told a story for those who knew how to read it, tracks leading in looping arcs, scuffed earth showing hurried withdrawal, patches of tangled brush where small German groups had paused before scattering under fire. By midday, the sky brightened slightly, though sunlight barely pierced the dense canopy. Snow melted slowly wherever it touched warm metal or fresh impact zones. The quiet was strange, fragile. Even the birds kept away from the forest's center. The infantry rotated shifts, allowing weary soldiers a chance to rest in foxholes where blankets had frozen stiff overnight. Others moved among the trees, securing fields of fire and checking for potential infiltration routes. They had lived through 2 nights of sudden chaos, and every man understood how quickly calm could be shattered. Behind them, the artillery crews worked in their usual steady rhythm. They cleaned their guns with a devotion bordering on reverence. Metals gleamed under pale winter light. Ammunition was stacked neatly, covered against the damp air. The crews knew another call could come at any moment. These intervals of stillness never lulled them into complacency. They used them to prepare, not relax. In the early afternoon, distant movement stirred the senses of the scouts posted farthest forward. At first it was just a faint rustle, the subtle shift of brush against boots, but trained ears noticed the difference between wind through branches and men trying to move quietly. Within minutes, whispers moved up the line, passed hand to hand, trench to trench, German reconnaissance. Small units, testing the edge again. The American infantry did not react loudly or visibly. They adjusted their posture, steadied their rifles, and waited. Officers crouched low, studying the terrain, They marked the suspected positions and quickly fed the data back to the fire direction centers. This time, however, the Americans did not rush to unleash the guns. They knew the Germans might be changing their tactics, attempting to bait an early barrage to reveal artillery positions or force premature expenditure of shells. The officers weighed each report carefully, matching sound with distance, noting movement patterns. The Germans stayed cautious, creeping forward in small 2s and 3s, trying to find a weakness. They didn't know the Americans were tracking their advance almost to the footstep. Finally, when a German group crossed a narrow gully and hunkered behind a fallen pine, the decision came swiftly. Fire, but with precision. Orders snapped down the firing line. This barrage was not the sweeping devastation of the previous nights. It was a scalpel. A handful of guns fired in rapid sequence, their shells landing with stunning accuracy along the gully and the flanking brush. Explosions ripped apart the quiet. Snow and bark flew into the air. German shouts pierced the forest, then faded just as quickly. The moment the last shell detonated, silence reclaimed the woods. For a long time, neither side moved. The Americans held their breath, rifles trained ahead. They listened for scrambling footsteps, for regrouping attempts, for the shifting cadence of an enemy forming for another push. None came. The Germans had once again been met with swift, surgical force. They had come looking for a weakness and found none. The scouts pushed a little farther this time, just enough to verify the withdrawal, but not enough to risk ambush. They returned with the same story. The Germans weren't preparing a new assault. They were repositioning, perhaps even reconsidering the fight altogether. By evening, confidence flowed more openly through the American line. Not arrogance, just the kind of firm steadiness earned after surviving multiple nights of uncertainty. They understood the rhythm of the battlefield now. They knew how the enemy moved, how they tested, how they retreated under fire. And they knew, above all, that the coordination between infantry and artillery had become a shield none of them had expected to rely on so completely. As the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows over the snow-covered ground, lanterns flickered on behind canvas screens. Small fires crackled in sheltered pits. For a rare moment, the men allowed themselves to breathe deep, steady breaths that warmed their lungs and eased their shoulders. The forest remained quiet. The line held, and though night approached once again, bringing the threat of yet another German attempt, the Americans faced it differently now. They stood ready, united not only by discipline and duty, but by the unspoken trust that the guns behind them would roar if needed, swiftly, precisely, decisively. Tomorrow would come with its own trials, but tonight they held the advantage. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.